I would like to now provide a brief overview of the key part of what we're going to cover in this course, which is the architecture development method. And I'll do so by going through the 10 phases and tie it to an example of using a smartphone for a hotel key. I think that will help to crystallize this in your minds. And then we'll move along to say, how would we describe that using the architecture content framework? So we'll lay out some of the key terminology regarding the architecture content framework so you can see how the ADM works with the architecture content framework. So the architecture development method, or the ADM, is the fundamental part of this course, and we'll dive into it a little bit here to give you some insights to it and why it's so popular. We use the ADM really as the way to envision and enable the change tied to enterprise architecture. So the key part that links to the architecture capability framework is the preliminary phase. Preliminary phase is where, in fact, we need to set up the organization, the skills, and target maturity with a governance body, and so on. So without preliminary phase, we don't have the ability to do the cycle. The ADM cycle is really from phase A to phase F, and that's the heart of the ADM when we talk about the ADM cycle. And then we have requirements management to help us move our way through from establishing the capability to establishing the beginning of a cycle in the first phase, phase A. And then we have two other phases, phase G and phase H, that help us with the governance of the cycle and the overall method. So just to cover these very briefly here, again, the preliminary phase that establishes and sustains your EA capability to do phase A, which establishes an architecture project of a new or enhanced capability. Once you have a vision that's specific, measurable, actionable, realistic, and time-bound, that's tied to your requirements for change and in the context of your organization and your charter, you can then say, okay, well, what are the things, the building blocks, the components or building blocks that would change in our business architecture, our actors, our roles, locations, functions, processes. So those are in phase B, business architecture. And then what would be the information systems that would need to change to support the new business architecture? So phase C, information systems architectures. And then phase D, what would be the technology we need to support our information systems architectures, which support the business architecture, which help us achieve our new or enhanced vision. So those are the main parts in terms of the definition of architecture gaps and needs to get to the new vision. Our phases A, B, C, and D. We're going to dive into each of these separately in a later lesson. But those are really fundamental. Those are the sweet spot of the architecture development method and of the work of an enterprise architect. Requirements management is tied to what are the requirements that lead you to want to have this newer enhanced vision, and then what are the requirements to get there. And as you move into phases E and F, this is helping you say, well, what solutions are possible to help us satisfy those gaps in capability that we need to get to our vision. So phase E are opportunities and solutions, where we are saying what vendors or what internal teams or resources, what sequencing, are we going to use transitions or not? These types of decisions are made in phase E. And then phase F, we're doing the full-blown planning on how we're going to select all the relevant building blocks or into work packages and sequence them in a way that makes sense to get us to that vision in as efficient a way as possible. So the key part of this is the A through F, supported by requirements management. Then once we have our plan, we need to realize that plan. And the role of enterprise architecture or enterprise architects in phase G is to oversee the implementation. So that's a special circle or special phase in the ADM, is to oversee implementation projects, to help govern them. And then phase H is looking at how well we're doing the whole architecture development method, as well as how we in fact are overseeing the implementation and updating our whole baseline architecture and learning for the next use of the ADM. So this is a flow that helps us to develop content from which we can derive requirements. It helps us to plan the transition from our existing situation where we have gaps to a situation where we realize those gaps with implementation projects that we need to govern. This is iterative. It comes off visually as a waterfall type of approach where you have all your requirements up front in the architecture vision, but in fact that's not the case. This is meant to be iterative. We need to have a good statement of objectives in essence with phase A, the architecture vision. I'll give a brief example. Here, let's say that we want to have like a next generation hotel and we want to use smartphones as hotel keys. So our architecture vision could be using smartphones for hotel keys. We want to increase business in the millennials by 20% in the first year. So that would require us then to say, okay, well, what would be the building blocks in the business architecture, in information systems architectures, where we have data and application architectures, and in technology architecture? What would be the building blocks of this new capability to use smartphones for hotel keys? Assuming that we're not doing it now, that's a big change. So we need to do modeling of how we do it now versus how we do it in the future, collect the gaps as requirements, and then make selections of building blocks organized in work packages or projects, and then sequencing those in as efficient and effective way as possible. And then, assuming that moves forward, in phase G, we would help oversee the various projects and tasks that are being engineered to realize that capability, which could take much longer than our plan took. But as things then progress and eventually land into our baseline architecture, we would be looking in phase H, which is architecture change management, say, okay, well, what we planned, was it actually implemented accordingly, or have other things changed that we need to take into account? And so we would come through perhaps with another cycle based on what we're learning from phase G and from phase H. But the key point here, of course, is iteration, because we're not going to have all the requirements up front in A, nor in B, nor in C, nor in D alone. We're iterating. So one more example is we're phase B and we're saying we're going to use smartphone for hotel keys. Well, that could change some different roles that could affect different actors. And we also need to consider what processes like checking in and checking out, for example. And then you're saying, well, okay, well, that needs certain applications, which would be in the information systems architectures, phase C. So what applications do we need that would help us to have the smart approach, more sophisticated next generation approach for people checking into a hotel, leveraging mobility, and also allowing us to perhaps personalize the experience a little bit more. So that would be a lot of apps that could be in play there. But if we need apps, well, we need infrastructure to support those apps, and we need network to support those, and that's phase D coming into play. And then we go, okay, when we get to E, what's possible out there? What vendors, what cell phones, what locking mechanisms are going to have to be considered here? What real estate needs to be considered? What changes in training and also in communications and marketing, and what's going to change in our competitive landscape in light of all this? So a lot of things to consider as we're moving into E and how we'd actually roll this thing out. And then in F, we look at it in a more comprehensive fashion and try to communicate to everyone what we see as work packages that make the most sense and the sequencing of those, so everyone can understand. And that would be the program management office. It would be the various other stakeholders, including development teams, implementation teams, and so on, procurement, human resources, marketing, sales. So we have a lot of people. Subject matter experts would all come into play in E&F to help us then have actual projects in G that we would be overseeing. And then again, H would say, well, since we came up with that idea, maybe other things have happened regarding security that we need to know about, so that we can take those into account, so that when we do the smartphones for hotel keys, that we also are providing great security to our customers, maybe better security than they even have now. So it's a very comprehensive method, but we're iterating. That's the key point there on the slide, between E and F, where we're looking at solutions for the smartphone, the messaging that would unlock a door, and then what's the locking mechanism, again, through what kind of network, with what kind of backup, on and on. And then as we start to explore real opportunities, we have to go back and revisit what are the real requirements that we need. So it's very iterative throughout the development of that. So in terms of modeling all of what I just described, we have in TOGAF a vernacular with the architecture content framework, which deals with the ways that we use deliverables or reports with visuals, which are artifacts, to describe the building blocks that we have versus the building blocks that we need for the new or enhanced capabilities, such as what I just described. So the architecture capability framework uses these three categories to help describe the architecture work, again, as we move from where we're at to where we want to go. So we have artifacts then which describe building blocks, which form the content of the architecture repository that we briefly mentioned in part 5 of TOGAF, as a tool that helps store our information about our building blocks and their relationships. So building blocks is a very popular term, and they're described in the overall model of an enterprise to say these are the entities that are important, and here's how they're related now, and here's how they could be related in the future. So deliverables in TOGAF are essentially reports. They're formally mandated work products that contain artifacts, which are visuals of 3 types: catalogs, matrices, and diagrams. So catalog is a table or a list. A matrix would be 2 or more lists that could be juxtaposed, such as in a pivot table, to say, for example, which actors on the one hand tied to which roles on the other hand, or which roles tied to which responsibilities. So you'd have matrices, and of course diagrams could be, just as they say diagrams, or could be models, could be photos that show often in a richer way how something would evolve. The architecture repository in TOGAF is a key part to support an architecture development method. The big part of architecture development method, again, supported by having the capability to do EA at all. We talked about the architecture capability framework. The architecture development method is helping us to, in fact, become masters of our architecture landscape, which you see here on this picture on the left, architecture landscape. So those various artifacts that we do, we would store in the architecture landscape that allows us to do the analysis of the building blocks that are in the top part of the repository, the architecture meta model. So that has our building blocks that we describe with artifacts in the landscape. And then we mentioned in TOGAF that there are reference models. Well, we put reference models in the reference library, and of course, as we're talking about change, we want to know what standards we have now versus what standards may be changing, and we want to select our building blocks, the new building blocks, in light of standards, our knowledge of standards. And we of course need to govern what we're doing here with these decisions about building blocks. Of course, it all fundamentally ties down to having an architecture capability. So the architecture repository allows us to distinguish between different types of architectural assets that exist at different levels of abstraction in the organization, and that particular part of talking about the abstraction, that would really tie more into the reference library to say what's the big picture, what is our overall reference model for the area that we're working, and how can we change in light of that bigger picture. So if I'm looking at my case study of using smartphones for hotel keys, I should have some reference material for abstracted material that helps me understand how hotels work and how this innovation would impact, but in light of the bigger picture of the hotel business, not trying to reinvent that from scratch. So the enterprise continuum is the way to understand the bigger picture. It helps us understand our architecture and our solution artifacts that we're creating. So the architecture ones relate to our architecture building blocks, the abstracted capabilities that we say we need for our target versus what we have in our baseline. And then when we talk about our solution artifacts, that would be our actual choices that we would make in terms of solutions and configurations to realize the capability that we're defining that we need as we move from architecture vision through business architecture to information systems architectures into technology architecture. We're saying we need to fill certain gaps. Well, the enterprise continuum helps us to capture that notion of building blocks, as well as the notion of abstraction versus realization as we move through. And it helps us. It's a way of thinking. We actually store things in the architecture repository, which we just covered. The enterprise continuum, though at a very high level, is saying what kind of knowledge do you need to affect the kind of changes that you have in mind, such as, again, mobility, with the case study that I just provided, with using your cell phones, and also the personalization that could come, enhanced personalization that could come from that, and then taking it to not just talking about generic change like that, but tie it to a particular organization, a particular hotel chain that wants to do this. So we now have to get into how they do things in their organization now versus how they do them in the future. So our modeling would then be organization specific. So the enterprise continuum then is set up to provide us that architectural context and help us understand our requirements for change. So you can see that on the top part of this slide. On the left, of course, there are many different kinds of enterprise repositories. The one that we're most concerned about in TOGAF is the architecture repository, which I just described. But the enterprise continuum is a way of thinking about what needs to go into your architecture repository to help you manage and master your architecture landscape. So the architecture context and requirements then help you look at your architecture building blocks for your logical layer of what are our capabilities without being specific to any vendor or any product. So these are where your architecture building blocks reside in the architecture continuum. And then you move down to solutions continuum, and you're saying, okay, what are the possible solutions that we could use to realize the capabilities described by architecture building blocks. So this is the basic construct of the enterprise continuum. And your deployed solutions, obviously, those would be solution building blocks. So to recap here, the enterprise continuum helps us to understand how we use building blocks. Building blocks at an abstract level, like I need the capability to unlock the hotel key, a hotel door with a smartphone. Okay, well that's abstract, and so that type of capability would be in the architecture continuum. But then I get in to say, well, I want to use a Verizon, or I want to use Sprint, or I want to use AT&T as my vendor, or I want to use an Apple phone, or I want to use Android phone, or I want to use certain browsers. So all of that's getting into your solutions continuum. And also then who would actually implement the changes. That would also be in those would also be solution building blocks in the solutions continuum. So the other aspect of this, as we read through these pictures here and understand the enterprise continuum, is that there is a relationship back and forth between the architecture continuum and solutions continuum, because the more we know about specific solutions, the more we're able to think about what we really want or need, and the more we understand the conceptual space, the more we can start directing, like with the reference architecture, how to do something in the solution space. So there's a very strong relationship between these two levels of the enterprise continuum, the architecture continuum and the solutions continuum. So one other overarching point to know as we move forward to talk about the architecture development method is that on the left side of the enterprise continuum, we're talking about very generic things. And on the right side, we're talking about very specific things, specific scenarios like I was just providing. So if I'm looking on the solutions continuum on the far right to specific solutions for a particular hotel, I could say, well, I want to go left to find out what kinds of things are out there. Well, I want to do benchmarking. So what kind of things are out there abstractly or concretely that could help me solve my problem on the far side? And do I have the skills and knowledge to do it? So this is a way of thinking about what does it take to succeed in your context. So that's really the value of this whole enterprise continuum aspect. It's important to provide the context for doing the method, and the descriptions, work products that you're doing as you move through the architecture development need to be in this context. A very important part of TOGAF is the ever-increasing knowledge, skills, and maturity regarding being masters of our architecture landscape. The expectation for an architect is that he or she can answer questions about business capability now or in the future. TOGAF has a way to help support that, help support that the use of information in a repository that could help us answer questions that our key stakeholders would have about our evolving business capability. So the architecture repository is that element in TOGAF, and tied back to the case study that I just provided about a smartphone using smartphone for a hotel key, we would have different visuals that we could put into the architecture landscape. We have different reference models, such as for a hotel, that we could put into the reference library part. And then, of course, we have standards on how you do business, how you manage data, applications, technology, security. You put those in the repository, but all tied to this scenario, I think, will help take this conceptual notion of an architecture repository and make it more understandable. And then we'll talk about the enterprise continuum, which will help us understand really the bigger picture of context. What is our context for change? And how do we, when we're tackling a specific problem, how can we benchmark to more general areas so that we're sure that we're on the right path? To make this more concrete, as we look at the enterprise continuum to wrap up this section, we're looking to use smartphones for a hotel key. That's a specific solution in a specific organization. That's in the solutions continuum part. However, we need to say, okay, what are the capabilities that would be required to do that, and what would be the rules, if you will, the checklists and so on at the more abstract layer. So that's where, again, we look at the specific example, and we can see where all our choices about solutions need to be in context and in light of best practices, in light of differentiators, in light of our own context. And that's what the enterprise continuum allows us to do. It allows us to benchmark, it allows us to innovate, but it always allows us to see where we're at on the spectrum of change.